Hi everyone, Jason here from spiritualbabies.net. We have done a series so far of what is, and we've covered many of the kind of big hitters regarding books. We are looking today at a very specific type of book or list of instruction that you will certainly come across if you've researched or taken part in a Passover ceremony or Pesach. So first I want to welcome back Rabbi Joshua Neely, who's going to be talking us through the content of this thing and explaining what it is. So thank you for sharing your time with us again today.
Always my pleasure.
I want to say it's Hagadah. I've been told I'm wrong. And then when I've changed, I've been told that's wrong too. So can you explain to us what the name of this particular document is, what that word means, and why it exists? I know that's a huge subject, but in a nutshell.
Yeah, well, I mean, the last one will probably take the longest, but the first ones are fairly straightforward. So Haggadah is the normative modern Hebrew pronunciation for this document. But Haggadah is the sort of casual Western English pronunciation. So both of them are right within their own setting. Neither one of them are technically wrong because we are referring to the same thing. We just happen to be using a different accent when doing so. What does it mean? Well, the word Haggadah literally means the telling. It is the telling. It is the telling of the story. And that is what the root of the word means. What's it for? What does it mean? What's its purpose? Well, I think that's probably what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about. But the thing to understand from the beginning is that its purpose is not to be recited the same way that we read the Torah publicly. When we're reading the Torah publicly, each and every word has to be read out loud, clearly, correctly, precisely, and made sure that it is absolutely the original words from the Torah. When it comes to the Haggadah, it is there to provide us a framework so that we do not miss anything that is required or anything that is essential. And it is a framework to teach us how to teach, how to tell the story of the Exodus in the way that emphasizes everything that needs to be emphasized.
So I always seem to bring things back to food analogies, which may be why I'm as large as I am. But I get the impression, because I have to tell everyone, we recorded this already, but there was a technical issue, and so this is our second go through. But my conclusion after having this talk already is that the Haggadah is a list of ingredients. I know I said this at the end of the last one. It's a list of ingredients to a recipe, which allows you a little bit of movement on how you make it, right? So everybody's grand does the best apple pie, and people will fight to the death that their grand's apple pie is better than their neighbour's, although they probably include very similar ingredients which make it an apple pie. And I think the Haggadah, its purpose and its content is to make sure that the conclusion of your Passover Pesach includes what makes that Pesach Pesach. Would that be fair?
I think that's fair. As long as we're staying with that same analogy, as long as you end up with a pie that has apples and with a crust that has wheat and wheat flour and water and whatever in it, then you're fine. And how much cinnamon you put in, that's up to you. How much sugar you put in, that's up to you. But there are certain core ingredients which we'll cover that need absolutely to be there in order for it to be an apple pie, in order for a Seder to be a Seder, and the Haggadah is there to make sure you get them. But it's also there to elevate beyond just those basic ingredients. So you're not just sitting there eating an apple that's been covered with a bit of dough.
So I think the way we're going to go through this, if you just ignore the police sirens in the background, somebody just had a fight over an apple pie. The way we're going to do this is to virtually talk through the stages of what goes on during Pesach celebration regarding the Haggadah. But the reason that we even have one, I think, we can take straight back to the Torah, right, which is a nice thing to do, and it's the commandment that you should tell your sons or express to your children what happened at Passover, at the original Passover.
Exactly right. The Torah says in multiple places, and we'll come back to that when we talk about the four sons, that we need to tell our children or answer their questions when they ask us about this amazing occasion. And the Haggadah is the framework for making sure that when we do that we do it right. The stages of the Haggadah, which, like you said, we'll be going through, are there primarily to make sure we do it, but it's also an interesting sociological transformation. These are similar to the courses of a meal, literally the courses of a meal that would have been there in the ancient Greco-Roman times. They had banquets and they had symposiums and other sorts of things that were centered around meals. And they have been recast into a Passover-specific form. They have been made uniquely Jewish by the Haggadah. So it's almost like copying the template and then erasing all of the content for each of those stages and replacing it with things that were either deliberately ironic from the original or completely unheard of in the original, in order to make this a spiritual feast, not just a gastronomical delight.
So it's specifically trying to set that night apart from other nights, which is going to come up later as well.
It is inviting comparison with the way that it is done in the Greco-Roman world, precisely so you can see the differences.
If you are watching this and you're at home in front of your computer and you're able to, if you don't have one of the documents, you can go and do a quick search now online, and there are dozens of them that are free. And please feel free to find one and open it up and look through the content as we talk about what the content is, and get a kind of a more 3D experience of it rather than just listening to us talk. Have a look at the text. There are some beautifully illustrated ones. There are some very modern ones. There are some kind of Pesach in 5 minutes, how to get the Haggadah faster, and there are some which will take you 8 or 9 hours, and you can decide how lucky that is yourself. So how would we start off? We've come to the table.
Just a second. You can cut this out, but I'm just sending you a link if you want to put it. One of the best sites, as I've mentioned to you before, and that I always want to give a plug out to, is Sefaria.org, and they have a great Haggadah, both with the Hebrew and the English, and with many of the commentaries already translated. So
great. That will be under the video.
It's a great starting place for somebody. And obviously, like you said, there are so many wonderful resources out there to embellish and enrich the Haggadah, to really make the Seder go deeper than just this framework. So people shouldn't stop with just this.
Yeah, and you can make it your own, and year on year you can add new tradition and new teaching, see what works for your kids, what doesn't work for your kids, and make it more of something that your family does as a tradition, because that's really what it's supposed to be about. It's inviting your children to be better students and to become the teachers to their children that you hope you are now. Okay, so what would be, we've just come to the table, we're sitting down, or what would be the first thing that happens?
So the first thing that's going to happen at the Passover Seder, according to the Haggadah, is going to be what's known as Kadesh, the segment where we do the Kiddush, where we do the blessing over the day, over a cup of wine. And that is a common element to all the holidays. But of course, for Passover, the blessing is going to contain references even more explicitly to the holiday of Passover and the Exodus from Egypt.
It's worth. So if you're a new viewer and you're new to Judaism, Passover happened one time, but when we talk about Passover on a yearly basis, it's a remembrance of that one event, and it's a dinner that happened. And just occurred to me that people might have come here for the first time and they don't really know what Passover is. So the historical event of Passover is being remembered on a yearly basis with a meal. And that's what we say when we're talking about Passover. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah, probably important to get that clear for people who maybe haven't heard. Sometimes it is important to remember not everybody already has that basic background. So this first drink of the wine is the first of 4 cups of wine that are going to be drunk ceremonially throughout the evening's festivities. And I should point out that a cup of wine does not have to be a giant 8-ounce water glass. A cup of wine just has to be a few ounce sort of minimum, and it can even be grape juice for those that have alcohol issues. It can also be wine but watered down. Interesting cultural note, in the original discussion of the Passover Seder that takes place in the Mishnah, they don't talk about pouring a cup of wine, they talk about mixing a cup of wine. You would pour a little bit of wine syrup into your cup, you would add water to taste, and then you would mix it as you liked. So if 4 cups of wine is going to be too strong for you, that doesn't mean you cut out the cups. It just means you cut down the amount of alcohol in each one.
That's fantastic. I love it. I love it when I hear new things. I hadn't heard that. And I didn't know that was how it was done.
Yes. I mean, it literally says, and they mix a cup of wine rather than they pour a cup of wine.
See, as an Englishman living in Ireland, I know a bit about kind of the history in my country. And in the Middle Ages, beer was the drink.
Right.
And ale, and that was safer to drink than water because the enzymes in it killed off a lot of the infection. But they'd give that to kids, but they'd water it down and make it easier to take. And I just don't know why I wouldn't assume that was the same the world over, but yeah, that's great. Okay. After the blessing, where the food isn't blessed, but the Creator is blessed for the item, what happens next?
So after that, after doing the Kiddush, we then go on to what's called urchatz, which is the washing of the hands. Now, for those that are familiar with the usual Jewish requirement of washing hands before eating bread, this is not that. This is a takeoff of the Greco-Roman food, and this is washing for just general cleanliness, because we are about to eat something, but it's not bread. We are about to have what would normally be an hors d'oeuvre, but is going to be recast in karpas.
And karpas, I found out, means, because as you said, these are all different stages of an actual meal. Karpas, like you said, hors d'oeuvre or appetizer.
Right, exactly. And of course, in the Greco-Roman world, this would be any number of delights and sweetmeats and wonderful things that might be had as a prelude in order to prepare you for the huge feast to come. But for the Seder, it is a green. It is something that is a green grown from the ground. Usually it is something associated with springtime. In North America, parsley is sort of the standard. And it is dipped, as was the custom to dip foods in the ancient world all the time, but it here is dipped in salt water. Rather than being dipped in something more flavorful. And the salt water is a remembrance of the tears and the sweat of slavery. And
the haroset, would that come out at this time as well?
The haroset is not going to make an appearance until much later. It's there, of course, on the Seder plate. All of the different components to the meal are laid out on the table as we begin. But the eating of the haroset comes much, much later. And we'll explain what it is when we get there.
So I found that listed in the few really random ones, and I thought it was a bit early and a bit too enjoyable to fulfill that requirement. Now, the next stage is we're introduced to matzah. So before we go into that, can you explain a little bit about what matzah is?
Of course. So matzah is one of the signature foods of Passover, not just the Seder for Pesach night, but for the entire holiday. Matzah is bread, but it is unleavened bread. That is to say, it is bread that has neither had a leavening agent, such as yeast, added to it, nor has it been allowed to simply sit on its own and leaven naturally from wild yeast, as it's been explained to me, and from its own natural fermentation process. So that means that matzah is made by pouring flour and water together and having the whole process baked in under about 18 minutes. So it is a very quick way to make bread. Most modern matzah you'll see today is machine made and it has been rigorously made to the point that it is now perfectly dry, flat, and crunchy. It doesn't technically have to be crunchy. You can have unleavened bread that is soft, but it's very rare to see that these days.
Yeah, if you're in the creative spirit, you can get the stuff and do it yourself super fast in an oven or the inside of a really hot wok. It's kind of fun and use them as pizza bases and all kinds of things. So yeah, there are going to be two types of matzah that you're going to find in the shops, right? There's the machine stuff, and then there's the handmade ones, which are a bit more expensive. And the machine ones are more like a cracker than a dry bread.
They don't have any give at all.
Yeah, a lot of people don't like them. I don't mind them, to be honest. I kind of look forward to filling my. To be honest, I still have 2 boxes from last year, and they'll probably be perfectly okay this year. Right, so
it does technically go stale, but it is a little hard to tell.
It's really hard to tell. All right, so we have these dry breads that are introduced to the meal. They are a reflection, right, of the bread that would have been baked on the night when everyone knew they were going to leave. They put their clothes on. They were told we're going to leave soon.
Right.
And they made flatbread because it didn't have time to allow it to rise. And that's a reflection of that bread.
Exactly. And, you have to remember that without modern yeast, or even without sourdough cultures, or even with sourdough cultures, the process of making bread does take hours in order to allow it time to rise. Whereas this, obviously, it just takes minutes from water and flour mixing to have something you can throw into your bag and take with you when you're about to head out in the wilderness.
The tradition today is that you take 3 of these matzah and they go onto the table, but what happens to them?
So the tradition is indeed to take 3. They go onto the table, and at this point, at Yachatz in the Seder, the middle matzah is broken, and the larger portion of it is hidden away, is stored to become the afikomen, which will be the dessert for the meal once we get past the actual main meal.
Before there were 3, can we
Right.
talk a little bit about what there was before and why we have 3 today?
It's a really good question, because a lot of people, when they set up their Seder table, just go by whatever the Haggadah told them to do and don't ask the questions of why is it 3? And there are lovely interpretations about 3 that came much, much later. The idea of being the Kohanim, the Levi'im, and the rest of us, the Israelim, the 3 segments of the Jewish people. It's a lovely idea. But the actual history is even more fascinating. So I'll try and do this briefly. But for every holiday, Shabbat especially, but every holiday, we have 2 loaves of bread on our table. And this is a reflection of the lechem mishneh, the 2 loaves, the 2 portions of manna that we received on Friday in order that we would not have to go out and gather manna on Shabbat itself. That was one of the first commandments that we received after leaving Egypt. So it is standard to have 2 bread loaves on that plate. So when the Seder began, way back in antiquity, it would have been natural to simply have 2 pieces of matzah, two loaves of matzah, 2 slices of matzah. And then you break one of them in half, and now you have really made lechem oni, you have made the bread of affliction, the bread of poverty, because you have diminished from that 2-portion quantity. However, in the Middle Ages, there was a lot of discussion about whether or not this was the right way to do it. Because after all, if you have diminished now to 1.5 loaves, then you don't have that minimum amount that was reflecting our gratitude for the double portion that God gave us when we were in the wilderness. So it was reintroduced, especially or initially in the Ashkenazic world, it was reintroduced to have another loaf of matzah, another slice. So now you could have 2 complete slices, as well as still breaking the middle one, so that you also were reflecting the affliction of slavery.
Wow. Okay. I'm sure if a lot of people are going through this the first time, that sounds quite confusing. But it really isn't. Listen to it again; it'll all make sense. Especially if you just have the pieces in front of you. When the time comes, it'll be good. So the middle piece is broken in half, and the larger half of that, as you said, the afikomen, is then wrapped up, and there are different traditions of what happens with that piece, right?
Right. Well, everybody agrees that the afikomen will be the last thing that we eat from our entire meal, not counting the cups of wine. So that is universally agreed upon. That is one of the laws of the Seder. But what happens between this break and that eating, there are different customs. So many people have the custom of having the parent or the leader of the Seder hide the afikomen, and then the children will have to go looking for it. And then customs diverge. Sometimes the children are rewarded for finding it. Sometimes the children will hold the afikomen ransom. And they will hold it as a hostage and ransom it off back to the table, because they know that the Seder can't conclude without it. In some other customs, the children try to steal the afikomen. They try to find a way to get it away from the parents in order to then be able to ransom it back. And this game is explained in any of its varieties by the different customs, is explained as a way to keep the kids focused and interested and have their attention throughout the entirety of the meal, and especially the telling of the Seder, the telling of the story of the Seder, because, as we all know, keeping kids' attentions is a rather important thing.
So the piece is hidden, smuggled, stolen, or whatever happens to it.
And kidnapped, right?
Or kidnapped. And the feast then moves on to kind of what most people would believe is the meat of the meal in the telling of the story.
Exactly right, the Magid. So this comes from the same root as the word Hagadah, the word Magid. This is the telling, the actual recitation of the story of the Seder. And it starts off with a focus on the matzah that has just been broken. It's a natural segue by saying this is the bread of affliction, lechamoni, and this is what we ate, our ancestors ate in Egypt. And then there is an invitation, and this is done in Aramaic, which was the common language in the ancient world when the time that the Haggadah was being developed. It's an invitation to anyone that is hungry to come and eat, and this would be made by going to your front door, opening the door, and looking in the street. And if there was anybody out there who had not been able to find a place to have a Seder, you would be inviting them in to join you with the Seder. And this is one of the ways that we continually concretize the message of our slavery and of our affliction to actually help others who are also afflicted in the modern time, whether it be by slavery or just by poverty.
I think maybe before Pesach rolls around, we might go through that Passover story together. That might be a good subject to go through and talk about the plagues and why they were important and why, and a lot of the symbolism and things behind it might be kind of interesting, because we don't have the time to do that in this show. But
right, I mean the
we'll
full
cover it.
The full story is a wonderful thing to dwell on. Indeed, you can dwell an entire night, Passover night, on it. But that's probably best left for its own episode. And instead, we'll look at the framework that the Haggadah gives us for telling that story, because that's fascinating in and of itself and something that is often overlooked. Because when you hit the Magid, you'll find that many people will be conducting it the same way they conducted the Kiddush, or the same way they conducted Karpas, which is there are words on the page, and I read the words and I do the action, and then I check that off the list. Not literally, of course, but then it's done. But when you reach the Magid, the whole point of it is to engagingly tell the story and expand upon what's on the page. It's not just about ticking the box. And
it's interactive, right? It's like
absolutely, and it begins with that very notion, right? With the famous 4 questions.
It's kind of any child from the 80s will be familiar with Choose Your Own Adventure paperback books.
Exactly. Yes. Great
and
fun with those.
This has that kind of feel to it. All right, so we're onto the 4 questions now. And there are specific questions. We can cover them quickly now, but maybe going forward we'll do a show just on the 4 questions, and as kind of maybe how can you expand your own Passover night? We maybe can give you some ideas on those. Can you explain to us why there are 4 questions in the first place? Why isn't there just one question and everyone pitches in and tries to answer it?
Well, technically, depending on how you read the grammar here, there really is only one question, which is how in what ways, right? Ma nishtana, in what way is this different than all other nights? That's really the generic question that we are trying to make sure that our children in particular, but even the adult participants, are thinking about of what are we doing differently now than the way we normally eat? Because every difference has a significance, has some meaning, and reminds us of why we're eating, above and beyond the fact that we're eating. Because we're eating is nice, but that's not the reason we sat down tonight. So it lists in our modern Haggadot, it lists 4 ways that our night is different than all other nights, and each one of those can be considered a question, which is how we get the phrase 4 questions. So one of them is, on all other nights we eat chametz, that means leavened bread or matzah, but tonight we only eat matzah. And that was true for them for up until very recently, when people used to make bread in their own homes. Sometimes you just make bread by doing the water and flour thing, and you'd make it in a pan or throw it in your oven, and you'd pull it out 10, 15, 20 minutes later and you'd eat. Nowadays we all buy our bread ready-made, so we don't have that kind of chametz. But it was normal to have both at any given time. Now we're only doing the matzah. All of the nights we eat any vegetables, but tonight we're going to be eating maror, a bitter herb, which is not usually on our table. We don't normally sit down to eat a deliberately excessively bitter herb. On all of the nights, we don't dip our food at all, but tonight we're going to be dipping twice. One of them we've already done. That was the dipping of the karpas, the parsley in the salt water, and the second one's going to come later when we get back to that haroset question. And on all of the nights we eat either sitting up or reclining, but tonight we are reclining during the meal, and that would have been exceptionally literally true during the ancient times, when reclining meant sort of eating on one of those Roman chaise lounge kind of things.
Does the reclining thing happen in many modern Jewish homes?
Not in terms of having a lounge chair, but in terms of reclining while drinking the cups of wine and reclining during other parts of the Seder, absolutely. Absolutely.
So you're encouraged to relax and slouch, and
you'll see people who have special pillowcases that they use for their chair in order to pad it and make it nicer. You'll see people who will just have the custom of sort of turning and leaning when it comes time for reclining. But definitely it is something that is still done, and we at least do it specifically at certain points, like the drinking of the cups of wine. To emphasize at those points that we are free as we do this. Now, these 4 questions were not originally 4 questions. These 4 questions were originally 3 questions when you look back in the Mishnah, where you first find an example of this. And that's the point, that these are example questions. And as the way that we've done the Seder has changed, for example, the Mishnah talks about how we roast the Passover sacrifice, and obviously we don't do that now. As the Seder has changed with history, so too have the questions. In the ancient world, they asked, why do we dip twice when normally we only dip once? But after people stopped dipping their food regularly, the question became, why do we dip twice when normally we don't dip at all? So it's meant to be real questions. It's meant to be real questions, not just a formula that is recited. And it's also meant to be the opening. It's the beginning. It's trying to show people who don't know how to ask questions, or don't know that they're allowed, that they should be asking a lot throughout the evening. If these are the only questions we ask during the evening, then something's gone horribly wrong.
I love as well that a document which dates back so many thousands of years accepts that people have different learning styles, and and that they can be taught through asking questions in different ways. I mean, today it's a given that some people take in information because they're more focused on what they hear rather than what they see, or what they see, and or their sense of smell. And you can approach people in that way, and you can say, "Did you see that? It looks great." And then people will think, "Yes, it does." "Well, did you hear about this? It sounds brilliant." And they'll take it that way instead. And it seems that this was accepted, that people are going to be turned on or turned off in a certain way, and this, by covering different questions in different ways, or the same question in different ways, it will bring people into the conversation. And for something that people may think is kind of old and not very valid, it's actually kind of a very modern idea.
Yes, and the emphasis is that the obligation is on the teacher, that it is not up to the student, young or old, to learn it how it's being taught. It is up to the teacher to make sure that the message, which remains constant, is taught in a way that will be understood by the student.
So we could talk about the answers, but I think better that people find those themselves. And we go on to the next part, which is an interesting one, I think, in the concept of the 4 sons.
Right. Well, just as we get to there, we're just going to do a quick little emphasis that we get a preliminary answer to the question. We were slaves, and God took us out. That's like the back of the envelope answer to why we're doing all these things. It doesn't give you a lot of specifics, but at least it sums it up. And then points out that even though you could get that point across, and even though people might remember it, you have to continue to expand and expound and go beyond that. And the more you do it, the better you are off. And then they give an example of 5 rabbis who were very famous, very learned, amazing rabbis. And it gives an example of somebody who is still learning even late into his life, new insights and new information, and that he is rejoicing that he still gets to learn later and later. So no one should ever think that the Seder is just for kids. No one should ever think the Seder is just for people who are ignorant and haven't learned a lot. Everybody has an obligation to keep learning. And then that goes into our archetypes of the 4 sons, the 4 children, of reminding us that as there are 4 different ways the Torah talks about teaching the story to our children, there are 4 or more different styles of children that we may encounter, and that we need to respond to them differently. And we need to make sure that each one of them gets the answers that he or she needs at that moment in order to help them continue to grow. And the answers that are given are in our Haggadah are different than they are in the Rishalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, which are a little different than some of the other versions we have. Again, emphasizing that how you answer is more important than the literal text on the page.
So there are traditional questions, and each one is assigned to one of the 4 children. Do you want to go through them now, or should we?
I think we can save that. If we get a lot of requests for going through any one of the different parts, whether it be the 4 questions, the 4 children, or the midrashic telling of the story of the Exodus, I'd be happy to sit down and we can take it to pieces. But I think if we want to get through the whole Haggadah in slightly less time than it takes to go through the whole Haggadah actually on Passover, then we should probably press on with the framework.
Great. Okay, so if you're watching and you would like us to cover any of this in more detail or any particular part, please leave comments under the video and we will certainly do that.
But now we get to the part that really is what most people would have thought we'd begin with when we're trying to tell the story, which is the story. So far up to this point, we've basically just been doing sort of lesson plans and guidance to teachers and some of the short answers you might give for different situations. But now we're going to give one version of an expanded answer. And we're going to be using the expanded answer that was put before us by our sages, which is to use the text that comes from the book of Deuteronomy, that was the Bechorot, the first fruits that would be brought. This was the declaration that a Jewish pilgrim would make when he brought the first fruits offering to the temple. And what they do is they take this section, which is, just a second, Deuteronomy 26, beginning with verse 5. They take this declaration and it will be dissected word by word, phrase by phrase, to see in it the entire complexity of how we ended up in Egypt, of what our life was like in Egypt, and how miraculous was our deliverance from Egypt. So something that in its original is just a few sentences becomes this lengthy way of retelling the story. It's an encapsulated formula for capturing the grandeur of the Exodus, something that could be easily remembered, because remember, most people didn't have a printed Haggadah in their home, let alone one for every person at the table. And then having remembered it, you could go through each part of it and unpack it and unpack it and unpack it. And it was a brilliant way to encapsulate the story and make sure that everybody remembered the gist of what we are celebrating.
So that particular verse, Deuteronomy 26, 5 through 8, I think, is read, and then we go on to talk about embellishments to the story and the plagues.
Right. And by the way, it's a great example for those of you who have watched our video on Midrash. This is a great example of how Midrash works, of going into word by word, phrase by phrase, of an unpacking.
Because the tradition is, right, that there are no wasted words.
Exactly
so
right.
Every word in there has a value and a specific reason to be there.
Right. God was not trying to reach a certain word count for his editor. So if he put a word in, that word matters.
Now, there's a specific tradition to do with the plagues, and it's not the one where you throw stuffed toys and plastic frogs and stuff. Although that's a lot of fun. That involves removing a drop of wine from a wine glass with a fingertip, or pouring a little bit out onto a saucer. Can you go through that and explain what that means?
Exactly right. So when we reach the part of the story where we remind ourselves of the plagues that were that befell the Egyptians, we will either pour out from our wine, or we will take with a finger and drop from the wine onto the saucer, a drop for each of the plagues, as we recite the list. And this is a reminder that we would have preferred. It would have been better. Our redemption would have been even more celebratory. We would have had a fuller cup of wine had, when Moses first went to the Egyptians, had the people of Egypt simply said, you know what, you're right. How are we so stupid? How are we so cruel? Here, please take these gifts, leave, go back to your homeland. We are so sorry that we enslaved you. But unfortunately, because of their stubbornness, our liberation was tainted with the acts of retribution and coercion that were necessary to finally convince them that indeed this is what the God of the whole world wanted to happen, wanted to transpire. And our joy is slightly diminished. We still have to have an almost full cup of wine because we were liberated from slavery, and that is one of the most monumental human acts ever. But we also have to remember that it came with a cost.
Okay, and you were saying there that it would have been enough. There's a song that's sung, right, along those lines.
Exactly. In just a little while, there's a great song called Dayenu, which means it would be sufficient for us, meaning that it would be sufficient for us to praise God and celebrate had God only done part of what he had done for us. That is to say, we would have been able to recognize God's existence and God's beneficence if he had only done the plagues but hadn't actually liberated us. That still would have been enough for us to say, this God, this is amazing, and we would have been celebrating. All the more so, we are going to celebrate given how many things above and beyond God did for us in this whole process. It's quite literally counting our blessings.
And if you get a chance, if it's your first time you're hearing that song, go and look up the lyrics. The words of that song are really lovely, and I think it's a good prayer format as well. It's really nice. I enjoyed that. I want to ask you, do you have somewhere to be at the top of the hour, or do you want to continue?
I've got a few more minutes. I think I've got about another 15 minutes or so.
So we should be.
I think we'll be okay. Yeah. So so now we're going to plunge after that part of just the wow factor of the Exodus. We're going to plunge back into the practical, the minimal, another answer of what is this Passover stuff by Rabban Gamliel's Three Things. So Rabban Gamliel, one of the greatest of the Tanaim, the great sages of the Mishnah period, said that in order to fulfill your obligation of the Seder, you have to mention and understand at least three things. And they are the Pesach sacrifice, the Matzah, and the maror, the bitter herbs. And so we get a paragraph about each with the citation of why these are important and a little bit of an explanation about each of them. And that is sort of the last part of the retelling that is necessary before we get to the beginning of the celebration, which is going to be song, meaning the first half of Hallel, and then followed by the beginning of the meal.
It's worth mentioning that Hallel means to worship and rejoice.
It's the same root from the word hallelujah.
Yeah, which literally means praise God.
Exactly.
It's kind of. I always found it funny growing up in the Christian tradition, as I did. We just said hallelujah, hallelujah, when actually it was a commandment for other people to actually do it rather than just say it. You know, it'd be like, stand to attention. Everyone's going, stand to attention, rather than standing to attention. Anyway, that always made me giggle. So after this is another ritual washing of the hands.
Right. Well, just right before that, after the beginning of Hallel, we do the end now of the Magid, of this retelling and praise of God, we drink the second cup of wine. But having done the second cup of wine, we are now ready to begin the meal. But rather than just diving into the main course, we have to go through these symbolic foods. So the first symbolic food is the matzah, but because matzah is bread, now we are going to do the official hand washing. This is the washing for ritual purity, not just for cleanliness. A good reminder, by the way, as an aside, that ritual purity has nothing to do with how dirty your hands are. Ritual purity is a spiritual act, and therefore is completely unrelated. And if your hands are dirty, so much so that you know that the ritual washing is not going to be sufficient to make them clean, you should go wash them with soap and water before you do the ritual washing. So we do that, and then we do the blessing over the matzah, both the normal blessing for bread as well as the blessing for the commandment to eat matzah as well. And this is matzah straight. So we're not putting any butter on it. We're not putting any other dips on it. This is just eating the matzah itself.
Okay.
And once we've done that, then we eat the maror, the other standout food of the Passover Seder. And maror is the bitter herbs. We could do an entire episode about what counts as maror and what doesn't. I'll say it in the short version. Horseradish, which is very common in the American Jewish community, is not the ideal form of maror. The ideal form of maror is a bitter herb, meaning plant, leafy thing. And there are plenty of them out there that are recommended, and we can talk about that some other time. But
something that's probably rich in iron, that's that kind of tinny, bitter feeling to it.
It's something. It's just to give a quick difference. There's a very different taste between something that is hot or spicy and something that is bitter. And the purpose of eating the maror is not to suffer the pain of slavery. It is to feel the bitterness of slavery. And those are two very different emotions, because it wasn't the pain of suffering that our people had trouble surviving. It was the bitterness of slavery. And it was the bitterness that made them unwilling initially to listen to Moses and God. It wasn't the pain that made them unwilling. So capturing bitterness at the Seder is very important, and it also avoids all the macho contests of who can eat the most horseradish and other nonsense.
Okay.
All right.
So now we
get to Korach, which is the Hillel Sandwich.
Yeah.
And this is a reminder of what would have been done in the ancient day, where you would take the matzah, you would take the maror, the bitter herbs, you would take the haroset. Sorry, we should have just mentioned that. The haroset is this apple, winey, cinnamony goop. It looks like mud or mortar that we dip the maror in, because too much bitterness without a little bit of sweetness is not good for you. It's literally unhealthy by the Talmud's rules, and therefore we have to cut that bitterness just a touch with this dip in the haroset. And of course, looking like the mud that was used to make the bricks in Egypt is a very important reminder. So we take the matzah, we take the maror, we take the haroset, and we would be taking a piece of the meat from the Passover sacrifice, but of course we don't have the Passover sacrifice, so we have to eat it with just those base ingredients. And then we have dinner.
you say, but that we don't have the Passover sacrifice, but isn't the lamb that's on the plate a substitution for that? Would people still? No.
It is not a substitution. The shank bone that we put on there is a reminder of the sacrifice that we don't have, right? Which is very different than saying it is a substitute sacrifice, right? There is no such thing as a substitute Passover sacrifice. The Passover sacrifice is the lamb that is sacrificed on the eve of Passover and then eaten at the Seder. There is no way to substitute that. You can't say, well, I did one last year, so I don't have to do it this year. You can't have leftovers, right? The sacrifice has to be eaten that night. So there's no such thing as a sacrifice, and you can't eat a piece of meat that wasn't sacrificed at the altar of Jerusalem as a sacrifice for that. There's a bit more complicatedness with regards to exactly how the sacrifice took place before the altar and what happened after, but the short answer is no substitutes, no alternatives. We don't have it, therefore we have to acknowledge that we're not eating it, even as we remember that we did.
That's perfect. Really, that's a perfect answer. So, would it be usual then to go to a Passover Seder and for there to be no lamb in the meal?
There are different customs in different communities. There are some communities that will specifically not serve lamb because they don't want to give the appearance that this is a substitute for the actual sacrifice. But there were other communities that say, no, look, everybody knows this isn't from the altar of Jerusalem because, I'm sitting here in Orlando and I didn't fly there and back again with my lamb. So therefore, this isn't an issue. And so they're happy to have the lamb either because it was the food that was most commonly available to them, or the food they enjoyed most, or because it was a reminder of the real sacrifice, even as we all knew that it wasn't the actual sacrifice. But opinions are divided in different communities on the right way lamb should or shouldn't be served.
Fabulous. Okay, so you've had your little Hillel sandwich, and now you are going on to fill your belly.
And now we get to the actual meal. As people have been asking, when do we eat? When do we eat? When do we eat? Now we eat. And as I mentioned before, the end of the meal, the final thing that we're going to eat is that piece of the afikomen, that little bit extra that was taken from that middle matzah that we broke so long ago, is now going to be broken and shared around the table as the last taste of the Seder, because unlike, again, our Greco-Roman neighbors in the ancient world, we were not going to have just more indulgence at the end. We weren't going to be going to another party and, do the equivalent of the pub crawl from house to house and gorging and eating. We were still commemorating slavery, and therefore the most fitting final taste in our mouth should be the bread of affliction, should be the taste of matzah.
And after you've had that one piece at the end, that's it, no more food.
That's it, no more food. We will still have wine to drink because we've got 2 more cups to go through. But no more snacking, no more food, no extra dessert, no coffee after the Seder itself. This is it. You should go to bed with the taste of matzah still in your mouth.
So we move on then to a blessing
right
after the meal.
And this is the regular Birkat HaMazon, regular for a festival and with the insertions for Passover. But this is, as we always do, we do a blessing after we've eaten to say thank you for what we've just had. There are, like I said, additions and changes because it is Passover, but the basic format will be familiar to anyone who does this on a regular basis. One thing that is done here that is not always done for every Birkat HaMazon in every part of the world is to have a cup of wine be used for this blessing. That's a custom in some places to do it with a cup of wine for every Birkat HaMazon, but not in every community. But for the Seder, everybody has a cup of wine for Birkat HaMazon. After Birkat HaMazon, we then go into more praise of God and more the rest of Hallel, as well as additional songs and additional hymns and lots of other things that are added to make the celebration of what God has done by bringing redemption to an enslaved people as a model for redemption for the entire world into existence. And once all of that has been finished, and we're not going to go through every single song that's there, then we get to our 4th cup of wine. And the 4th cup is really that cumulative statement of how amazing this is and how much we hope that there will be a final restoration and redemption for Israel, for Jerusalem, and for the world. And then we drink that 4th cup. Now there is a 5th cup on the table. And the 5th cup is usually referred to as the cup of Elijah, or Elijah's cup. It's important to note, though, that cup is not for Elijah to drink. That cup is waiting for us to know whether we should drink it. This is based on the origin of the 4 cups. The 4 cups are based on the 4 verbs of redemption that are mentioned in the book of Exodus. But in that passage, or rather in the next sentence from that passage, there is a 5th verb that talks about us being brought into the land of Israel. And there's a debate within the rabbinic world of whether or not we are supposed to drink on Passover a 5th cup of wine in commemoration of that promise of redemption as well. And as we're not sure, we can't say a blessing that would be in vain. So we leave that cup filled, but waiting. And we wait for Elijah because the idea is in all of rabbinic literature that when Elijah comes as the herald to the Mashiach, one of the things he will do will be to answer the unresolved questions that we still have. And so when he shows up, may it be speedily in our days, he'll say, yeah, fifth cup, that's for Passover too, and we'll drink it. Or he'll say, fifth cup, no, that's not for Passover, but we'll do it some other time. Then we would just leave the cup undrunk.
And the cup's not for Elijah. That's blown my mind.
I know. I shatter so many people's memories. I know people who do a whole shtick where they will, when the kids go to check the door for Elijah, they'll secretly sip some of the wine and say, "Look, he drank some." And it's I hate ruining childhood customs like that, but there is a reason for that cup, which is it's a reminder that we are in flux, that we are waiting for redemption, and that we're not 100% sure of exactly what the world is supposed to be at this moment. And that sense of self-doubt and recognizing that with all this joy that the process of redemption is still incomplete, I think is a more important message. And so I don't enjoy ruining people's ideas, but I do enjoy helping them find, hopefully, a more meaningful understanding of why that cup is on the table.
Absolutely. Okay, so I feel it's winding down now. What's left?
What's left is us to declare, right? We have done the Seder according to the laws. We have done the Seder the way it was supposed to be done. This year, we have been here. Next year, let us be in Jerusalem. And then it goes on to the prologue, or sorry, the epilogue of additional songs and additional hymns.
And they party till the break of dawn.
Pretty much, yes. Exactly.
That's great. All right, and are we done? Have we managed? And that's pretty much within an hour.
I think that's all we need right now. I mean, obviously, like I said, we can go into more detail. We can talk about the wonderful songs that are there. The Who Knows One or Haggadah are big favorites. There are so many different things that are in the Seder that need much more in-depth discussion. But for understanding how the whole Seder hangs together, how it is a template, a script for you to then build on and to expand upon and to really question and answer and engage with each other and with the story, I think we covered that theme pretty well.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. We've, if you were listening at home, we've offered you the bones. You can go and source your own meat, or if you have questions and about this or any part of this you'd like the rabbi to expound on, please let us know in the comments section, and we will certainly cover them. This video is not time sensitive, so if you have questions, let us know, and if we don't get round to them this Pesach, we will have done by the next one. Thank you very much, Rabbi Neely, for giving us all your time and insight. It was very educational.
Thank you, Jason.
And we'll see you guys very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.